The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets surrounding Buckingham Palace as Sarah Matthews hurried along the sidewalk, clutching her camera bag tightly against her chest. At 23, she was a freelance photographer, trying to make her mark in London's competitive media landscape. Today felt different, though. She had received a tip about a special ceremony happening near the palace gates, and if she could capture the right shot, it might be her big break. Sarah had grown up in a small town outside Manchester, where her biggest worry was whether the local newspaper would publish her photos of the annual Harvest Festival. Moving to London 6 months ago had been a dream come true, but the reality was harsher than she had imagined. Rent was expensive, jobs were scarce, and competition was fierce. Every day brought new challenges, but Sarah's determination never wavered. As she walked along the palace perimeter, Sarah noticed the usual crowd of tourists gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. The red-coated guards stood motionless at their posts, their tall black hats creating imposing silhouettes against the ornate palace facade. She had photographed this scene dozens of times, but today she hoped to capture something unique, something that would set her work apart from the countless other images of royal ceremonies. Among the guards stood James Wellington, a 28-year-old member of the Queen's Guard who had served for 5 years. Unlike many of his colleagues who came from military families, James had joined the army after losing his job at a factory in Birmingham. The structure and purpose of military life had given him direction when he felt lost, and being selected for the Queen's Guard was the proudest moment of his career. James took his duties seriously, perhaps more seriously than some of his fellow guards. He had memorized every protocol, every rule, every exception to those rules. His superiors often praised his attention to detail and unwavering commitment to duty. Standing perfectly still for hours at a time, maintaining composure regardless of what tourists did or said, never breaking character. These were not just job requirements for James. They were matters of personal honor. On this particular morning, James noticed the young woman with the camera. She moved differently from the typical tourists, more purposefully, with the practiced eye of someone who understood composition and timing. He watched from his peripheral vision as she positioned herself for various shots, always respectful of the barriers and never interfering with official proceedings. Sarah spent the morning photographing the ceremony from different angles, hoping to capture something special. The light was perfect, casting dramatic shadows and highlighting the intricate details of the guards' uniforms. She felt confident about several shots, particularly one where she had captured the precise moment when the guards crossed paths during their routine march. As the formal ceremony concluded and crowds began to disperse, Sarah decided to walk around the palace perimeter once more. She wanted to photograph the guards in their normal standing positions, capturing the solemnity and dedication that defined their service. The afternoon light would create different moods and shadows, potentially offering new creative opportunities. The streets around the palace were busier now, filled with tourists heading to nearby attractions, office workers returning from lunch breaks, and locals going about their daily routines. Sarah found herself caught up in the flow of pedestrian traffic as she made her way along the wide sidewalk that bordered the palace grounds. She paused near a section where the palace wall was lower, offering a clear view of the guards at their posts. Through her camera lens, she could see the same guard she had noticed earlier. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an intensity in his bearing that suggested deep commitment to his role. Something about his posture spoke of genuine pride in his service, not just the mechanical execution of duties. As Sarah adjusted her camera settings to compensate for the changing light, she became aware of footsteps behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. The sidewalk was busy and people were constantly walking in both directions. But these footsteps seemed to be matching her pace, stopping when she stopped, starting when she moved. A chill ran down her spine as she realized someone might be following her. Sarah had heard stories about women being harassed or worse in busy tourist areas, where perpetrators could blend into crowds and disappear. She tried to dismiss her concerns as paranoia, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Without turning around, Sarah quickened her pace slightly, hoping to lose whoever might be behind her. The footsteps quickened too. Her heart began to race as she realized her fears were justified. Someone was definitely following her, and their intentions were becoming increasingly clear as they made no effort to hide their pursuit. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to lose her pursuer in the crowd, but the sidewalk ahead seemed to be clearing as people turned down side streets toward other attractions. She could approach other tourists for help, but most seemed focused on their own activities and might not understand the urgency of her situation. The palace guards were visible in the distance, but Sarah knew they were not supposed to leave their posts or interact with the public except in the most extreme circumstances. Their role was ceremonial and symbolic, not that of active security personnel for random citizens on the street. Behind her, the footsteps grew closer and more aggressive. Sarah could hear heavy breathing and muttered words she could not quite make out, but their tone was unmistakably threatening. Her photographer's instincts told her to document what was happening, but her survival instincts told her to focus entirely on getting to safety. The irony was not lost on her that she was being stalked within sight of one of the most heavily guarded buildings in the world. Yet she felt completely vulnerable and alone. The guards she could see were bound by centuries of protocol and tradition that prevented them from abandoning their posts, even if they witnessed someone in distress. As Sarah continued walking, trying to appear calm while her heart pounded, she began to realize that her situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The person behind her was no longer trying to hide their pursuit, and their behavior suggested someone who had moved beyond mere harassment into something far more threatening. The afternoon sun that had seemed so perfect for photography now felt harsh and exposing, making her feel like a target with nowhere to hide. The man following Sarah had been watching her for over an hour. Derek Mills was a 35-year-old drifter who had arrived in London 3 weeks ago with no money, no job prospects, and a growing resentment toward the world. He had spent years moving from city to city, taking temporary jobs when he could find them, sleeping in shelters or on the streets when he could not. Derek had noticed Sarah earlier when she was photographing the guards. Something about her confident demeanor and expensive camera equipment had triggered his anger. To him, she represented everything he felt he had been denied: opportunity, success, and the financial security to pursue dreams rather than merely survive day to day. As he followed her through the crowded streets, Derek's intentions began to crystallize. Initially, he had simply wanted to intimidate her, perhaps snatch her camera and sell it for quick cash. But as he watched her move through the area with such apparent ease and belonging, his plans became darker and more personal. Derek had a history of escalating confrontations with women he perceived as privileged or successful. In Manchester, he had been arrested for harassment after following a businesswoman to her car and making threatening comments. In Liverpool, he had been banned from a shopping district after repeatedly bothering female shoppers. Each incident had been dismissed as minor harassment, but the pattern was clear to anyone who looked closely enough. Now, as he closed the distance between himself and Sarah, Derek felt the familiar rush of power that came from frightening someone. He enjoyed seeing her quicken her pace, enjoyed knowing that he was the cause of her obvious distress. The crowded tourist area provided perfect cover for his approach, and he knew from experience that bystanders rarely intervened in situations that appeared to be personal disputes. Sarah's breathing became shallow as she realized her pursuer was getting closer. She could hear him muttering under his breath, and the few words she could make out made her blood run cold. This was not a random mugging or a case of mistaken identity. This person intended to harm her, and his comments suggested he had been watching her for some time. The street ahead curved slightly, and Sarah could see that the crowd was thinning out as people dispersed toward different attractions. Soon she would be more isolated, with fewer potential witnesses or sources of help. The realization that her situation was becoming critical hit her like a physical blow. James Wellington had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours, maintaining the perfect stillness that his position required. From his peripheral vision, he had observed the usual flow of tourists, the changing of light as clouds passed overhead, and the gradual shift in crowd patterns as the day progressed. However, something had caught his attention about 20 minutes ago. The young photographer he had noticed earlier seemed to be in some kind of distress. At first, he thought she might simply be lost or confused about directions. But as he continued to observe, James realized she was being followed by a man whose body language and behavior set off every alarm bell in his trained military mind. James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard, and he had developed an instinct for recognizing predatory behavior. The way the man moved, the deliberate nature of his pursuit, and the increasing aggression in his posture all indicated someone with harmful intentions. The protocols governing James's behavior were absolutely clear. Under no circumstances was he to leave his post, speak to tourists, or involve himself in civilian matters. The Queen's Guard was a ceremonial position, and maintaining the dignity and traditions of that role took precedence over almost everything else. Breaking protocol could result in disciplinary action, demotion, or even dismissal from the service. But James also remembered his oath as a soldier, his duty to protect innocent people, and the values that had drawn him to military service in the first place. As he watched the situation unfold, he faced an impossible choice between following orders and following his conscience. The man following Sarah was now close enough that James could see his facial expression. There was a cold determination in his eyes that James recognized from his combat experience. This was not someone who was going to be deterred by witnesses or the proximity to law enforcement. This was someone who had made a decision to act regardless of consequences. Sarah's options were running out quickly. The street ahead led to a quieter area with fewer people and less foot traffic. Behind her, she could hear her pursuer's breathing getting heavier, and his muttered comments becoming more explicit and threatening. She knew that within the next few minutes he would make his move. She thought about screaming for help, but the tourists around her seemed absorbed in their own activities, and she worried that drawing attention might actually escalate the situation. Many of the people nearby were elderly tourists or families with small children who would be unable to provide meaningful assistance even if they wanted to help. The palace guards were still visible in the distance, but Sarah knew enough about their role to understand that they were not supposed to abandon their posts. She had read articles about tourists trying to get reactions from the guards, and she knew they were trained to ignore almost everything happening around them. As Derek continued his pursuit, he began to fantasize about what he would do when he caught up with his target. The camera equipment alone would be worth several £100s, enough to keep him fed and housed for weeks. But more than the money, he was motivated by a desire to exert power over someone he saw as privileged and entitled. Derek had spent years blaming others for his failures and setbacks. In his mind, successful people like Sarah had taken opportunities that should have been his. Their success was proof of a system that had excluded and victimized him. Attacking her would be a way of evening the score, of taking back what he felt he deserved. The street curved ahead, leading toward a section with fewer shops and restaurants. Derek knew this was where he would make his move. There would be fewer witnesses, less chance of immediate intervention, and multiple escape routes if things went wrong. He had scouted the area earlier in the week, noting the locations of security cameras and the typical patrol patterns of local police. James felt his military training warring with his ceremonial duties as the situation continued to deteriorate. Every instinct told him that the young woman was in real danger, that intervention was not just justified but morally required. Yet breaking protocol would violate everything he had been taught about discipline, duty, and following orders regardless of personal feelings. He thought about his commanding officers, who had emphasized repeatedly that the Queen's Guard represented centuries of tradition, and that individual guards were simply temporary custodians of that legacy. To break protocol for personal reasons, no matter how compelling, would be to put his own judgment above the wisdom of generations of military tradition. But James also thought about why he had joined the army in the first place. It was not just for the structure and discipline, though those had been important. It was because he believed in protecting people, in standing between innocent civilians and those who would harm them. The uniform he wore was supposed to represent those values, not just blind obedience to rules. As the distance between Sarah and her pursuer continued to shrink, James realized that he was witnessing the kind of moment that would define not just his military career, but his character as a human being. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the curve in the street where the crowd would thin out significantly. Behind her, she could hear Derek's footsteps growing more confident, more aggressive. He was no longer trying to hide his pursuit, and his muttered comments had become loud enough for her to understand their threatening nature. The photographer in her noticed details with startling clarity: the way shadows fell across the pavement, the sound of traffic in the distance, the smell of street food from a nearby vendor. But these observations felt surreal, disconnected from the terror building inside her chest. Her hands trembled as she gripped her camera bag, knowing it contained not just expensive equipment, but also her laptop with months of work. Derek was now close enough that Sarah could smell cigarettes and unwashed clothing. When she risked a quick glance over her shoulder, she saw a man whose appearance matched his threatening behavior: unkempt hair, stained clothing, and eyes that held a disturbing combination of anger and anticipation. He was enjoying her fear, feeding off it, and that realization made her situation even more frightening. The few remaining tourists ahead seemed oblivious to what was happening behind them. An elderly couple walked slowly, discussing their lunch plans. A family with young children pointed excitedly at the palace in the distance. None of them appeared to notice that a young woman was being stalked by a dangerous predator just meters away from them. Sarah considered her options desperately. She could try to run, but Derek was larger and probably faster. She could scream for help, but the nearest police officers she had seen were several blocks away. She could duck into a shop, but most of the businesses in this area catered to tourists and might not understand the urgency of her situation quickly enough. The camera bag bouncing against her hip reminded Sarah of her father's advice when she first moved to London. He had insisted she take a self-defense course and carry pepper spray. The pepper spray was buried somewhere in her bag, but she knew that trying to find it now would only alert Derek to her defensive preparations and possibly trigger him to act sooner. James Wellington watched the developing crisis with growing alarm. His military experience told him that the situation was reaching a critical point where intervention would soon be impossible. The man pursuing the photographer was displaying classic predatory behavior: confident posturing, territorial advancement, and escalating aggression that suggested an imminent attack. The other guards at nearby posts remained focused on their duties, unaware of what James was observing. Protocol dictated that he should report any security concerns through proper channels, but there was no time for bureaucratic procedures. The threat was immediate and personal, not the kind of organized security issue that palace protection systems were designed to handle. James thought about his sister Emma, who was about the same age as the woman being stalked. Emma was also trying to build a career in a competitive field, working as a nurse in Birmingham while studying for advanced certifications. The idea of someone targeting Emma the way this man was targeting the photographer made James's blood run cold. His commanding officer's words echoed in his mind. The uniform comes first, always. Personal feelings, personal judgments, personal desires, none of these matter when you are wearing the Queen's colors. But another voice, one that sounded like his father, reminded him that uniforms were meant to serve principles, not replace them. Derek Mills felt the familiar surge of power as his target showed obvious signs of panic. This was the moment he enjoyed most in these encounters, when his victims realized they were trapped, when their confidence crumbled and was replaced by the fear he felt most people deserved to experience. He had chosen this location carefully. The street curved here, creating a natural blind spot from the main tourist areas. The shops were spread farther apart with fewer people walking between them. Most importantly, the palace guards were far enough away that they could not interfere even if they wanted to, which Derek was confident they would not. Derek had researched the Queen's Guard after arriving in London, curious about the famous soldiers in their red coats and tall hats. What he learned had convinced him that they were essentially living statues, bound by rules so strict that they could not help anyone even if they witnessed a crime in progress. They were symbols rather than protectors, and symbols could not hurt him. As he closed the final distance between himself and Sarah, Derek began to speak louder, making sure she could hear his detailed threats about what he planned to do. He wanted her to understand that this was not a random crime of opportunity, but a deliberate act of punishment for what he perceived as her privileged existence. Sarah felt her knees weaken as Derek's threats became more explicit and personal. He had clearly been watching her for much longer than she had realized, and he knew details about her movements that terrified her. This was not a spur-of-the-moment attack, but something he had planned and anticipated. The curve in the street was just ahead now, and Sarah knew that once she rounded it, she would be in a much more isolated area where Derek could act without fear of immediate intervention. Her photographer's eye automatically noted the security camera mounted on a nearby building, but she realized grimly that cameras were useless for preventing crimes, only for documenting them afterward. Behind her, Derek's breathing had become heavier and more excited. Sarah could hear the sick anticipation in his voice as he described what he planned to do with her camera equipment and what else he might take from her. His words were designed to paralyze her with fear, and she realized with growing horror that his strategy was working. James felt sweat building under his heavy ceremonial uniform as he watched the final moments of Sarah's pursuit unfold. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to abandon his post and intervene, but years of military discipline held him in place like invisible chains. The weight of tradition, protocol, and potential consequences seemed to anchor his feet to the ground. He thought about the oath he had taken when joining the Queen's Guard, the promise to uphold the dignity and traditions of the service regardless of personal cost. Breaking that oath would not just affect his own career but would damage the reputation of the entire regiment. His actions would be scrutinized by superiors, investigated by military police, and potentially used as an example of why strict discipline was necessary. But James also remembered another oath he had taken years earlier, when he first enlisted in the army. That oath had been about protecting innocent people and serving something greater than himself. The Queen's Guard was supposed to represent the best of British military tradition, and surely those traditions included courage, honor, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. As Sarah approached the curve that would take her out of sight of the main tourist area, James realized that he was about to witness either a violent crime or his own moral failure. The choice between following orders and following his conscience had reached its moment of truth, and there was no more time for internal debate. Derek smiled as he saw his target hesitate at the curve ahead. He could sense her terror, could see the way her shoulders tensed as she realized she was running out of options. This was exactly how he had imagined it would happen, and the reality was even more satisfying than his fantasies had been. The street beyond the curve was quieter, lined with service entrances and loading docks rather than shops filled with potential witnesses. Derek had walked this route several times over the past few days, timing police patrols and noting the locations of security cameras. He knew exactly where he would make his move and how he would escape afterward. As Sarah took the first step around the curve, Derek lunged forward to close the remaining distance between them, his hand reaching out to grab her shoulder and spin her around to face him. The moment Derek's hand touched Sarah's shoulder, something snapped inside James Wellington. Years of military training, protocol, and discipline suddenly took second place to an overwhelming compulsion to act. Without conscious thought, James broke from his rigid ceremonial stance and began moving toward the unfolding attack. His heavy military boots echoed loudly on the pavement as he ran, the sound cutting through the ambient noise of tourist chatter and distant traffic. The distinctive rhythm of his footsteps caused several tourists to turn and stare in amazement. They had never seen a Queen's Guard abandon his post, and many began pulling out phones to record what they assumed was some kind of special ceremony or emergency drill. Sarah felt Derek's grip tighten on her shoulder as he spun her around to face him. Up close, his appearance was even more menacing than she had imagined. His eyes held a cold calculation that suggested he had done this before, and his smile revealed teeth stained yellow from smoking and poor hygiene. The smell of alcohol mixed with his other odors, indicating he had been drinking to build courage for his planned attack. "Finally got you alone," Derek hissed, his voice low and threatening. "Been watching you all morning taking pictures like you own the place. Think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" His grip shifted from her shoulder to her camera bag, and Sarah realized he was preparing to either rob her or drag her to an even more isolated location. The sound of running footsteps registered in both Sarah's and Derek's consciousness at the same moment. Derek's head snapped around, expecting to see a police officer or security guard responding to a call for help. Instead, he saw something that made no sense. One of the famous Queen's Guards in full ceremonial dress, running directly toward them with obvious intent to intervene. James's mind was remarkably clear as he closed the distance to Sarah and her attacker. His military training had kicked in automatically, assessing the threat level, planning his approach, and preparing for multiple scenarios. The man attacking Sarah was larger than average, but appeared to be in poor physical condition. More importantly, he was clearly not expecting any kind of resistance or intervention. The ceremonial nature of James's uniform worked to his advantage in an unexpected way. Derek was so shocked by the sight of a Queen's Guard breaking protocol that he momentarily loosened his grip on Sarah, unable to process what he was seeing. In his research about the guards, everything he had read emphasized their inability to leave their posts or interact with the public under any circumstances. Sarah felt Derek's grip slacken and immediately tried to pull away, but his surprise lasted only a few seconds before anger replaced it. "This is none of your business, soldier boy," Derek snarled, tightening his hold on Sarah's bag while keeping one eye on the approaching guard. "Go back to your little post and play dress-up, James," was now close enough to see the fear in Sarah's eyes and the dangerous gleam in Derek's. His military experience told him that Derek was the type of person who would escalate rather than retreat when confronted, making the situation potentially more dangerous rather than less. But James also knew that backing down now would leave Sarah completely vulnerable to whatever Derek had planned. "Release her immediately," James commanded in the authoritative voice he had learned during his military training. His tone carried the weight of absolute confidence, even though internally he was acutely aware that he was violating every protocol that governed his position. "Step away and leave the area." Derek laughed harshly, emboldened by what he perceived as an empty threat. "What are you going to do about it, toy soldier?" "You can't even leave your post without getting in trouble. I know all about you palace guards. You're just for show, not for real action." The taunt hit closer to home than Derek realized, touching on James's own internal struggle about the gap between ceremonial duty and practical service. But it also reminded James why he had joined the military in the first place. Not to stand motionless for hours, but to make a real difference in protecting people who needed help. Several tourists had now noticed the confrontation and were beginning to gather at a safe distance, some filming with their phones while others debated whether to call for help. The presence of witnesses created additional pressure for James, knowing that whatever happened next would likely be recorded and scrutinized by his superiors. Sarah took advantage of Derek's momentary distraction to try pulling free from his grip again, this time with more success. She managed to create enough distance to swing her camera bag around her body, putting it between herself and Derek while backing toward James. Her photographer's instincts noted the surreal nature of the scene. A ceremonial guard in full dress uniform, confronting a street criminal while tourists watched and recorded. Derek's anger flared as he realized his victim was escaping. Without warning, he lunged forward, no longer interested in stealth or avoiding attention. His plan had been to intimidate Sarah into compliance, but the guard's intervention had forced him to escalate to direct physical assault. He aimed for Sarah's camera bag, intending to yank it away from her and knock her off balance in the process. James reacted instantly, his combat training overriding any remaining hesitation about protocol violations. He stepped between Derek and Sarah, using his larger frame and military bearing to create a physical barrier. The weight of his ceremonial uniform, which normally felt restrictive and cumbersome, suddenly felt like armor as he prepared to defend someone who needed protection. "Last warning," James said firmly, his stance shifting into a defensive position that Derek was too inexperienced to recognize, but that any military personnel would have immediately understood as preparation for combat. "Walk away now or I will stop you." Derek's response was to swing a wild punch at James's face, aiming for the spot just below the tall ceremonial hat. The attack was telegraphed and clumsy, exactly what James would have expected from someone with no formal fighting training, who was acting primarily on alcohol-fueled aggression. James deflected the punch easily, using a blocking technique that redirected Derek's momentum while maintaining his own balance and position between Derek and Sarah. The movement was so smooth and professional that several tourists gasped in appreciation, though James was focused entirely on neutralizing the threat rather than impressing spectators. The failed punch left Derek off balance and exposed, giving James the opportunity to end the confrontation quickly and with minimal violence. However, he also knew that any action he took would be recorded by multiple cameras and would need to be justified, not just to his military superiors, but potentially to civilian authorities as well. Sarah watched in amazement as the guard who had seemed like a distant, untouchable figure just minutes earlier became her protector and potential savior. The contrast between his ceremonial role and his obvious combat competence was striking, and she began to understand that the uniform represented not just tradition, but also genuine military capability. Derek staggered backward from his failed attack, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. He had expected the guard to be ceremonial and ineffective. But the professional way his punch had been deflected suggested he was facing someone with real military training and experience. The confrontation had now attracted the attention of other palace guards at nearby posts. Though they remained at their positions while clearly monitoring the situation, James knew that backup would arrive soon. But he also knew that his decision to break protocol had already been witnessed by dozens of people and would have serious consequences regardless of the outcome. Derek's second attack came faster and with more desperation. Realizing that his initial assessment of the guard had been completely wrong, he abandoned any pretense of control and launched himself forward in a wild tackle attempt. His plan was simple: use his weight and momentum to knock the guard down, then grab the woman and escape before other security personnel could respond. James had been expecting exactly this kind of escalation. Derek's body language had telegraphed his intentions several seconds before he moved, giving James time to prepare a response that would end the confrontation without causing unnecessary injury. As Derek charged forward, James sidestepped smoothly and used Derek's own momentum against him, executing a textbook defensive maneuver that sent Derek sprawling onto the pavement. The takedown was so clean and professional that several of the watching tourists actually applauded, though they quickly fell silent as they realized this was not a demonstration but a real confrontation with potentially serious consequences. Sarah found herself staring at James with a mixture of gratitude and amazement, unable to believe that this stranger had risked his career to protect her. Derek rolled on the ground for a moment, stunned by how quickly and easily he had been defeated. His experience with violence had always involved intimidating people who were smaller, weaker, or caught off guard. Facing someone with professional combat training was completely outside his experience, and he was beginning to realize that his situation had become very dangerous very quickly. James stood over Derek with his hands ready but not threatening, projecting calm authority while remaining prepared for further attacks. His military training had taught him that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was often right after one party had been defeated, when desperation could lead to unpredictable and potentially lethal escalation. "Stay down," James commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "The police are on their way, and any further aggression will only make your situation worse." Derek's response surprised everyone present. Instead of continuing to fight or attempting to flee, he began to cry. The tears were not of remorse or regret, but of frustration and self-pity. His grand plan to assert power over someone he perceived as privileged had collapsed completely, leaving him face down on the pavement in front of dozens of witnesses with phones recording his humiliation. "This isn't fair," Derek sobbed, his voice muffled by his position on the ground. "She has everything and I have nothing. Why does she get to have everything when people like me get ignored and forgotten?" His words revealed the twisted logic that had driven his attack, the dangerous combination of entitlement and resentment that had convinced him that targeting innocent people was somehow justified. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she listened to Derek's outburst. Part of her felt genuine pity for someone who was clearly struggling with serious personal problems. But a larger part of her was horrified by his attempt to use his own difficulties as justification for attacking her. She thought about all the people who faced hardship without turning to violence, who found ways to improve their situations without victimizing others. James remained focused on the immediate security situation, but Derek's words reminded him of his own struggles after leaving the factory in Birmingham. The difference was that James had channeled his frustration into military service and self-improvement, while Derek had chosen to blame others for his problems and to express his anger through predatory behavior. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that someone had indeed called the police, and James knew that the official response to this incident was about to begin. He would need to explain his actions to his superior officers, justify his decision to break protocol, and face whatever disciplinary measures they deemed appropriate. But looking at Sarah's grateful expression, he felt no regret about his choices. Several other Queen's guards had now left their posts and were approaching the scene, though they maintained their dignified bearing even while responding to an emergency. James recognized Sergeant Collins among them, a veteran guard whose opinion carried significant weight within the regiment. The expression on Collins's face suggested that James's actions would be the subject of considerable discussion in the hours ahead, Sarah realized that she should probably move away from the scene to give the authorities room to work, but she felt reluctant to leave James without thanking him properly. She also understood that his decision to help her had probably created serious problems for his military career, and she wanted him to know that his sacrifice had been appreciated and worthwhile. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't—" She paused, unable to finish the sentence as the full implications of Derek's attack finally hit her. Without James's intervention, she might have been seriously injured or worse. James nodded acknowledgement but remained focused on Derek, who was still lying on the ground and showing no signs of attempting to flee or fight further. The professional part of James's mind was already preparing for the questions he would face about his decision-making process, his assessment of the threat level, and his choice to abandon his post. Derek had stopped crying but remained motionless on the pavement, apparently overwhelmed by the collapse of his plans and the realization that he was about to face serious legal consequences for his actions. His muttered complaints about unfairness had given way to silent sulking, suggesting that he was beginning to understand the gravity of his situation. The first police officers arrived within minutes, their professional demeanor shifting to surprise when they realized they were responding to an incident involving the Queen's Guard. The lead officer, a veteran constable named Murphy, had worked the palace area for years, but had never encountered a situation where a ceremonial guard had actively intervened in a civilian crime. "Right then," Murphy said, surveying the scene with experienced eyes, "who can tell me what happened here?" His tone was neutral but authoritative, designed to establish control over what could potentially become a complicated jurisdictional situation involving military personnel, civilian crime, and tourist witnesses. James stepped forward, his military bearing intact despite the unusual circumstances. "Constable, I am Guardsman Wellington of the Queen's Guard. I witnessed this individual," he indicated Derek, stalking and then physically assaulting this young woman. When the situation escalated to immediate physical danger, I intervened to prevent what appeared to be an imminent violent crime. Constable Murphy nodded as he absorbed James's concise report, his experienced eye taking in the scene and the various witnesses who were still recording with their phones. "And you, miss?" he asked, turning to Sarah with the practiced manner of someone who had interviewed countless crime victims over the years. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "My name is Sarah Matthews. I'm a photographer, and I was taking pictures near the palace when this man started following me. At first, I thought it might be coincidence, but then he began making threats and got increasingly aggressive." She gestured toward Derek, who was now sitting up on the pavement under the watchful eye of a second police officer, who had arrived moments after Murphy. "He grabbed me when I tried to get away, and I honestly don't know what would have happened if Guardsman Wellington hadn't intervened. The man made it very clear that he intended to do more than just rob me." Murphy made notes in his notebook while keeping one eye on Derek, who seemed to be alternating between sullen silence and muttered complaints about the unfairness of his situation. The constable had dealt with similar cases before and recognized the pattern of behavior that typically escalated from harassment to more serious crimes if left unchecked. "Right. Let's get some statements from witnesses as well," Murphy said, approaching a group of tourists who had observed the entire incident. Most were eager to help, though their accounts varied depending on when they had started paying attention and how clearly they had been able to see what was happening. An elderly German tourist named Klaus proved to be the most reliable witness. "I saw the man following the young lady for quite some time," he told Murphy in accented but clear English. "His behavior was very suspicious, very threatening. When he grabbed her, the guard immediately came to help. It was very brave, I think, because he left his important post to protect her." James stood at attention while the investigation continued around him, acutely aware that every word and action was being documented for multiple purposes. The police report would be one thing, but he knew that his superior officers would conduct their own investigation into his decision to break protocol. The weight of centuries of military tradition seemed to press down on his shoulders as he waited to learn the consequences of his choices. Sergeant Collins approached James with the measured pace that characterized all movements of the Queen's Guard, even in unusual circumstances. His expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about his thoughts regarding James's actions or their potential consequences. "Guardsman Wellington," Collins said formally, "you will remain here until the police investigation is complete. Then report immediately to Colonel Harrison for debriefing. Your post will be covered by the relief guard." The sergeant's tone was professional but not unsympathetic, suggesting that while James faced serious scrutiny, his actions were not being automatically condemned. James nodded crisply. "Yes, Sergeant. I understand." He had expected this response and was prepared for whatever disciplinary action might follow. The military justice system was thorough and fair, but it was also unforgiving when it came to violations of protocol, especially those as public and dramatic as his intervention had been. Derek was eventually helped to his feet by the police officers, who were preparing to transport him to the station for formal questioning and charging. As he stood, he cast a venomous look at both Sarah and James, his expression making it clear that he blamed them for his predicament rather than accepting responsibility for his own actions. "This is all wrong," Derek muttered, as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "She's got everything handed to her and I get nothing." "And you," he glared at James, "you're supposed to be neutral. You're not supposed to take sides." His words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service meant and what duties took precedence over rules and regulations. Sarah watched, Derek being led away with mixed feelings. She was relieved that the immediate threat was over, but she was also troubled by the obvious mental health issues that seemed to underlie his criminal behavior. Most of all, she was overwhelmed by gratitude toward James, whose split-second decision had potentially saved her from serious harm. As the crowd of tourists began to disperse and the police finished their preliminary investigation, Sarah found herself alone with James for the first time since the incident began. She struggled to find words adequate to express what his intervention had meant to her. "I know you probably got in serious trouble for helping me," she said quietly, "and I want you to know that I understand what you risked. If there's anything I can do to help explain to your superiors what happened, any way I can make it clear that your actions were completely justified." James smiled slightly, the first time his formal military bearing had relaxed since the confrontation began. "Miss, you don't need to worry about that. I made my choice with full understanding of the potential consequences. Military justice is fair, and if I face discipline, it will be because I knowingly violated protocol, not because my superiors don't understand the situation." The sincerity in his voice reassured Sarah somewhat, but she remained concerned about the impact his heroic actions might have on his career. "Will you lose your position? Will this affect your future in the military?" she asked, genuinely worried about the man who had risked everything to protect a complete stranger. "I honestly don't know," James admitted. "The Queen's Guard has very strict protocols about leaving posts and interacting with civilians. But the military also values protecting innocent people and acting on moral principles. I suppose we'll find out which consideration takes precedence." Constable Murphy approached them as he finished organizing his notes and evidence. "Right then, I think we have everything we need for now. Miss Matthews, you'll need to come to the station later today to provide a formal statement, but you're free to go for now. Guardsman Wellington, thank you for your cooperation. Your actions prevented what could have been a very serious crime." The constable's words carried unofficial approval of James's intervention. Though both men understood that military discipline operated according to different standards than civilian law enforcement, the police were grateful for James's help. But that gratitude might not translate into protection from military consequences. As the official response to the incident wound down, Sarah realized that she might never see James again. The formal nature of his position and the disciplinary proceedings he was likely to face meant that seeking him out later could potentially cause additional problems for him. "I wish there was some way to properly thank you," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "What you did today, it was extraordinary. You're an extraordinary person, and I hope your superiors recognize that." James maintained his professional demeanor, but Sarah could see the appreciation in his eyes. "Just knowing that you're safe is thanks enough, miss. That's what the uniform is supposed to represent. Protection of innocent people. Today I was able to live up to that ideal, regardless of what happens next." As Sarah walked away from the scene, she turned back once to see James standing at attention, waiting for his sergeant to escort him to what would likely be the most important meeting of his military career. She made a mental note to follow up on his situation if possible, determined to ensure that his sacrifice on her behalf was recognized and appreciated by those in authority. 3 hours later, James stood at rigid attention in Colonel Harrison's office, his ceremonial uniform still perfectly pressed, despite the afternoon's events. The colonel was a 30-year military veteran whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his commitment to maintaining the highest standards of military discipline. Behind him hung portraits of previous commanding officers, their stern faces seeming to observe the proceedings with silent judgment. Colonel Harrison had already reviewed the police reports, witness statements, and preliminary accounts from other guards who had observed the incident. He had also spoken with Sergeant Collins and reviewed the extensive video footage that tourists had captured of the entire confrontation. The evidence was clear about what had happened, but the implications for military justice were complex. "Guardsman Wellington," the colonel began in his measured, authoritative voice, "you understand why you are here. Your actions today represent a clear violation of standing orders regarding your duties while serving as Queen's Guard. These protocols exist for important reasons, and they apply regardless of circumstances or personal feelings about those circumstances." James maintained his stance at attention, his expression neutral despite the anxiety building in his chest. "Yes, sir. I understand completely, and I take full responsibility for my decision to leave my post and intervene in a civilian matter." The colonel studied James for a long moment, his experienced eye taking in the young guardsman's bearing and demeanor. Harrison had commanded soldiers in combat zones and understood the difference between reckless abandonment of duty and principled action under pressure. "However," the colonel continued, "I have also reviewed your service record, which is exemplary. Your combat experience in Afghanistan demonstrates genuine courage under fire, and your performance as Queen's Guard has been consistently outstanding. You are not someone who acts impulsively or without consideration for consequences." James felt a flicker of hope, but remained silent, knowing that premature optimism could be dangerous in military proceedings. The colonel's tone suggested that this conversation might not end with the severe disciplinary action James had been expecting. "Tell me, in your own words, what factors influenced your decision to break protocol this afternoon?" Colonel Harrison commanded, leaning back in his chair and studying James with the intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating character under pressure. James took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts carefully before responding. "Sir, I observed a clear threat to civilian safety developing over an extended period. The perpetrator displayed classic predatory behavior, and the victim showed obvious signs of distress and fear. Based on my combat experience, I assessed that the situation was escalating toward imminent violence against an innocent person." He paused, then continued with quiet conviction. "I understood that leaving my post violated protocol, but I also understood that failing to act would likely result in serious harm to someone who had no other protection available. I made a command decision based on my assessment of immediate threat and moral obligation." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with James's reasoned explanation. "And if you found yourself in similar circumstances again, knowing what you now know about the consequences, would you make the same choice?" The question was clearly a test, designed to determine whether James felt genuine conviction about his actions or was simply trying to avoid punishment. James met the colonel's gaze directly as he answered, "Yes, sir. If I witnessed imminent violence against an innocent person and had the ability to prevent it, I would intervene regardless of protocol. The oath I took when I enlisted was to protect people, and I cannot in good conscience prioritize ceremonial duties over that fundamental obligation." Meanwhile, across London, Sarah sat in her small apartment reviewing the photographs she had taken that morning, before her world had been turned upside down by Derek's attack and James's heroic intervention. The images seemed to belong to a different lifetime, taken by someone who had not yet experienced the terror of being stalked or the profound gratitude of being rescued by a stranger's courage. She had already provided her formal statement to the police, describing in detail Derek's threatening behavior and James's professional, measured response to the crisis. The desk sergeant had assured her that Derek would face serious charges for assault and harassment, with his history of similar incidents likely to result in significant jail time. But Sarah's thoughts kept returning to James and the disciplinary proceedings he was undoubtedly facing. She had researched the Queen's Guard online, learning about the strict protocols that governed their behavior, and the serious consequences that typically followed any deviation from established procedures. The more she learned, the more she appreciated the magnitude of James's sacrifice on her behalf. Her phone rang, interrupting her brooding. The caller ID showed her best friend Emma, who had seen news reports about the incident and was calling to check on Sarah's well-being. "I saw it on the news," Emma said without preamble. "There's video all over social media of a Queen's Guard tackling some man who was attacking a woman near Buckingham Palace." "Please tell me that wasn't you," Sarah sighed, knowing she would need to explain the day's events to friends and family who would inevitably learn about them through news coverage. "It was me, and it was exactly as bad as it looked. If that guard hadn't intervened, I honestly don't know what would have happened." Back in Colonel Harrison's office, the meeting was reaching its conclusion. The colonel had spent considerable time reviewing not just the immediate incident, but also the broader principles at stake when military protocol conflicted with moral obligation. "Guardsman Wellington," the colonel said formally, "your actions today violated standing orders in a very public and dramatic fashion. However, they also demonstrated the highest principles of military service: courage, selflessness, and commitment to protecting innocent life. After careful consideration, I have decided that your actions, while technically violations of protocol, were morally justified and operationally sound." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he maintained his formal posture and expression. The colonel's words suggested that his military career would survive this incident, though he suspected there would still be consequences to face. "You will receive a formal reprimand for leaving your post without authorization," Colonel Harrison continued. "This will be noted in your service record, and you will forfeit 1 week's pay as penalty for the protocol violation. However, you will also receive a commendation for courage and initiative in protecting civilian safety under dangerous circumstances." The mixed nature of the discipline reflected the complex realities of James's situation. He had simultaneously violated military law and upheld military values. The formal reprimand satisfied the need to maintain protocol discipline, while the commendation recognized the moral courage he had demonstrated. "Furthermore," the colonel added, "your actions today have attracted considerable positive media attention for the Queen's Guard and the British military generally. The public response has been overwhelmingly supportive, with many people expressing pride in having soldiers willing to risk their careers to protect innocent civilians." James nodded his understanding, grateful for the colonel's balanced approach to a difficult situation. The discipline was fair and the recognition was meaningful. Most importantly, he would be able to continue serving in a role he valued deeply. That evening, Sarah was surprised to receive a phone call from a reporter asking for her perspective on the day's events and particularly on James's actions. She realized that the story had captured public imagination in ways that extended far beyond the immediate incident. "He saved my life," she told the reporter simply. "He saw someone in danger and chose to help, even though he knew it could cost him his career. That's the kind of person we should all aspire to be, and the kind of soldier we should be proud to have protecting us." Her words, along with similar statements from witnesses and officials, helped shape a narrative that celebrated James's courage while acknowledging the complexity of his situation. The story became a reminder that true heroism often required difficult choices between competing obligations. 3 months later, Sarah received an invitation to a small ceremony at which James would be formally presented with his commendation for courage. She attended proudly, watching as a man who had risked everything to protect a stranger received the recognition he deserved for putting moral principles ahead of personal safety. After the ceremony, James and Sarah spoke briefly, both understanding that his actions had created a bond between them that would last long after the immediate crisis had passed. He had shown her that heroism still existed in the world, while she had given him the opportunity to live up to his own highest ideals of service and protection.